everyone, as you're coming in from the waiting room. We'll give it a minute. Glad to see everyone. Welcome, welcome. So welcome to our webinar this afternoon. We're really excited to be sharing with you some of our great colleagues in different parts of the country and their work around supporting implementation in education and across sectors. So we hope everyone will feel free to leave on your cameras. We'd love to see some friendly faces out there. It makes this way more fun. But we are muted, and due to the number of people in the webinar today, which we are very excited about, please enter your questions in the chat and we'll try to get to those as we go. If not, we'll keep the chat and try to send out some of the answers to the questions that we may get when we send out the remainder of the information, which would be a copy of this PowerPoint and a recording shortly after we finish today. So a couple of, one big housekeeping thing. You may have heard that we had the distinct pleasure of having this webinar on the exact same day that they're testing the emergency broadcast system, right in the middle of this webinar. So what we're going to do is we're hopefully timing this where we're going to have our panelists and friends and colleagues introduce a little bit about themselves. So right in between when they're introducing themselves and the work they do, that will go off. So we'll just take a brief pause and let it do its thing, and then we'll resume back to normal. So if you hear us take a dramatic pause with the tone, just a reminder that that's a test of the emergency broadcast system. So again, feel free to put any questions in the chat and we'll try to get to what we can, but we have so much to share with you and such great work happening that we'll do our best. So we are from the SISEP Center, the State Implementation and Scaling Up of Evidence-Based Practices Center, funded by the Office of Special Education Programs. I am Sophia Farmer. Lovely to meet those of you that I haven't. I'm the co-director of the SISEP Center, and I'm joined by some colleagues of mine on the call. You'll see or might see Rebecca Hornak is in here helping in the background, as well as Amelia Krasinski. And I think my co-director, Karen Ward, will also be joining us in a bit. So welcome again. And we have with us some of our brilliant colleagues and friends from Wisconsin, Melissa Kahn and Scott Brown, as well as Kelsey Schmitz and Kurt Hatch from Washington. And they will get a chance to introduce themselves to you in a moment in more depth and much better than I could. But we're very excited to have them. They're brilliant friends and we learn a lot from them and the work that they're doing in this space. We also are very excited because we have great participation today from a wide variety of spaces and sectors. We have researchers and university faculty and educational agencies, other service providers, educators, TA centers, the whole 9 yards on this webinar today. And what we'll find as we go through this work is that while our work is predominantly in education, when we're talking about the role of an implementation support practitioner or those that support the work of implementation, that can happen in any field, right? And does. So our goals for us today are to spend a little bit of time on what exactly is that role of an implementation support practitioner and why are they needed? Why is this role needed? Why do we need folks like us to work in different organizations to have certain competencies and strengths and knowledge and skills to be able to support the work of moving practices from research to the field? So what do we mean when we say implementation support practitioner? That's a mouthful, right? That's a term for any professional, is how we're defining it. Any professional who really supports organizations, in particular leaders, or any staff who finds themselves in the role of implementing some type of practice or program, right? So when we're thinking about those things, those practices, programs, initiatives, those frameworks that we're all trying to put in place in our organizations, who are the people that are driving that work, right? Driving that systems change effort in your organization. That's what we mean when we say implementation support practitioners. Now, I had a mom that was an English major, so as Shakespeare said, what is in a name? That which we call a rose by any other word would smell as sweet. And our implementation support practitioners, Melissa that's on the call gets a giggle because I called them marigolds at one time, right? In one of the blogs that we wrote, right? So whether they're marigolds, implementation support practitioners, technical assistance providers, coaches, change agents, leaders, right? Improvement coaches, improvement advisors, right? These are the folks that we're talking about in your organization, either at the state level or district level or university level. There are friends that are really charged with making change happen. So regardless of their name though, there are certain skills that we've figured from the research that they need to be able to select and apply and tailor the implementation frameworks and strategies to your context. And that requires a very specific set of skills and competencies in this work. So the National Implementation Research Network, our parent center here at SISEP, in collaboration with the Center for Effective Services and the European Implementation Collaborative, engaged in a research-based process to identify these guiding principles and what they would be. Okay. These guiding principles, these skills, these competencies really tell us what helps to build the capacity of practitioners and communities to use interventions and approaches and evidence to improve our outcomes. So throughout this research-based process, what we discovered was there a set of dispositions, if you will, and that's what you see in the center of the circle, or these approaches that encourage us to be empathetic and curious, right? These mindsets, to be critical thinkers, to use core cross-disciplinary approaches, to advance equity, these core values or features or dispositions, if you will. And from those core behaviors, we bucketed that work or grouped that work into 3 domains. Okay, those domains are co-creation and engagement, ongoing improvement, and sustaining change. So those are the big areas that we operate in as implementation support practitioners. And in each of those domains, there are anywhere from 3, 4, or 5 competencies for a total of 15 competencies or very specific behaviors that an implementation support practitioner puts to use every day. And while we outline what those are individually, they're all intertwined, right? So we build relationships, but we can do that in service to brokering, for example. And we'll talk at the end of the webinar about how you can specifically learn more about what this work is or what these competencies are. But before we do that, I want to introduce you to the friends we have with us. Because they are the experts in the field, right? They are the folks that are doing this work every day and making sure systems change happens. And we're going to start with Wisconsin. There we go. Now I got it.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Scott Brown, and I currently serve as a statewide implementation specialist. My position is funded through and situated at CISA 2, which is one of our 12 regional services agencies throughout the state of Wisconsin. Before state service, I've actually held a couple of different roles at the state level, including serving as the consultant for specific learning disabilities when our rule for identification changed. And before state service, I was an elementary teacher. I went on to become a dean of students and an associate principal for student services at a large high school. and then a director of student services at the school district level. And it is a pleasure to be here with you this afternoon.
Thanks, Scott. Hi, everybody. My name is Melissa Kahn. I am so happy to be joining all of you today and see a number of our friends and colleagues from across the great state of Wisconsin as well. My role is implementation consultant. My position is situated on the special education team at the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction, our state education agency. I get to do amazing work with Scott Brown and others to support our implementation efforts, linked from state to region to district and school, teacher and classroom. I have spent a number of years in the field as a middle school social studies teacher, an elementary assistant principal and principal, internationally as a program manager for a school leadership program, and have been at DPI since 2015. So our job here is to move forward into just providing some context setting for the work that is underway in each of our respective states, specific to the work that we do as implementation support practitioners, so that then we can have a conversation amongst each other and share a little bit about how those experiences are playing out in relationship to our competencies and how we're engaging with the field. The implementation, and I'll call it a capital I implementation journey in Wisconsin. I mean, we've all been implementing things forever, right? And man, Scott and I have said, if we could have a do-over with some of the things we were implementing when we were leading schools or doing leadership work at the district or program levels, we wish we could have a do-over sometime, knowing what we know now. Our early implementation efforts in Wisconsin started back officially in 2016 when we entered into some exploration with SISEP. And we're looking to determine if it was a good fit between their support as a TA provider and the state education agency to really dig into some ways of work and support the capacity of DPI to ensure that we were doing the best work that we could, especially in relationship to our districts and their schools that had federal identifications under two really big federal laws, IDEA and SISEP. And so we spent several years digging into building our own capacity at the state level, linking that capacity and building it with several of our regional teams, and then carrying that work out with the implementation frameworks in mind across a number of projects, two of them listed here. One sort of centering within the work of our state personnel development grant, which at that time was focused on building a system of coaching to support inclusive communities, and work that we were carrying out in what we call the transformation zone, which was very specific work that SISEP was supporting as we partnered to establish regional implementation teams who would then collaborate with districts and schools to implement effective teacher practice. We spent several years boots on the ground doing that work. And I'm going to flash forward to where we are today, or fast forward to where we are today, which is to note that our current iteration of implementation work is being carried out in two ways. One, with a very broad focus around system alignment efforts, again, to sort of continue strengthening our continuous improvement supports for our federally identified districts and schools. And then more narrowly within what we refer to now as our implementation zone. And within the implementation zone, we're focusing on two specific areas of practice, one regarding early reading and the other continuing that work on inclusive communities. Rachel Ferdine, our partner at DPI, I think is on the call today as well, or the webinar. And she is leading the inclusive communities work. I'm supporting the early reading work. And within those two projects, boy, talk about lessons learned in those early efforts in our partnership with SISEP. We learned a lot. And, as an implementation support practitioner, that's something that is, I think, a key factor in what we do, is identifying what works, what doesn't work, and carrying those lessons forward into our ongoing efforts around usable innovation, how we select partner districts and other entities, how we allocate resources, how we build out decision support data systems, and ensure that we have both training and coaching in place to support the use of practice. When we think about the implementation zone, the information that's on this slide, in Wisconsin, the implementation zone, we have baked into our federal accountability under what's called Indicator 17, which for purposes of holding ourselves accountable under IDEA, we are ensuring that we are very specifically digging into identifying ways of improving outcomes for students with IEPs. And in Wisconsin, we've linked that to our outcomes in ELA for students in grades 3 through 5. Our implementation zone really functions as what you could maybe think of as an incubator or a learning lab. It's intended to establish a consistent research-based implementation infrastructure so that we can support teacher practice as effectively as possible that actually leads to those sustainable and scalable changes in adult practice that we believe then guarantees more likely improved outcomes, especially for students with IEPs and students of color, which is where the data bears out in Wisconsin. That's where our most significant gaps are. And so when we think about this implementation zone within our broader implementation work, the opportunity within the implementation zone is really to dig into some very specific ways of work on a small scale, thinking about a small slice of our system. Sophia, you can go to, Sophia, you can go to the next slide. Thinking about what the outcome is that we're intending to impact, and then how are we going to get there? We are working within this small slice of the state, providing support to our intermediary support that's being carried out at the regional level, to districts and schools, a common approach to how we might lift up and really hone in on effective practice and what it takes in order to get those practices to fidelity. Sorry, there we go. Okay, sorry about that. So that we can identify what it takes in order to get to fidelity. What are the systems and structures that lead to that ability for us to replicate in additional sites so that we can sustain and scale that work over time? And so when especially in that project mission, when we're talking about supporting staff, it's really about making sure that we have a critical role as implementation support practitioners to support the capacity of the system and the teams within them to develop and sustain that critical implementation infrastructure. I'm going to turn it over to Scott so that he can share out a couple of the ways in which that's happening currently in Wisconsin.
Thanks, Melissa. So within and you can advance, Sophia, within the implementation zone that Melissa highlighted, the two projects that you see here are currently part of our implementation zone. ILC, or Inclusive Learning Communities, focuses on the installation of the Integrated Comprehensive Services for Equity framework, and that's based on the scholarship and work of Elise Ventura and Colleen Capper. And early reading focuses on the installation of two key practices in early reading, one being using text collections to build background knowledge, and the second being systematic phonics and phonemic awareness instruction. We chose those practices as a place to start for their potential impact, and we do recognize that they're not in isolation of the other practices of early reading. And practitioners from the field, so predominantly teachers, develop practice profiles for those areas. And you can advance, Sophia. So many of you will recognize this as the formula for success, and we've mapped out, at least from a high level, the aspects of our work that are underway. One of our lessons learned that Melissa shared was to clearly identify and define a specific practice. And to this end, both projects have developed practice profiles which serve as the basis for training and coaching. Wisconsin has developed a lot of high quality resources around coaching and related data collection, primarily through our Inclusive Learning Communities project, and is in the process of doing the same thing for training. So in this way, a common approach to training and coaching, as well as common sets of data, will help to inform implementation teams at all levels of the system of celebrations, successes, barriers, and areas that need further attention. Training and coaching will also be closely linked so that coaching becomes an integral support for practitioners in applying new skills they attained during training. And that'll be really critical as we continue to build out our training infrastructure. Our implementation teams will routinely utilize both training and coaching data along with fidelity data to calibrate supports. Our implementation zone is in the process of developing a common set of mutual selection criteria with flexibility for specific project needs. A big shout out and thank you to our colleagues in New Jersey, especially Chimobi, who provided us with some just-in-time learning, and we've incorporated a data-based model based on his work there for establishing a pool of potential school district candidates to whom to reach out to as potential partners for our projects. Based on our intensive partnership with SISEP, we've invested in developing our implementation zone implementation team, as well as project-based implementation teams for each of the two projects. The implementation zone team functions as our state level implementation team. So sort of creating that implementation infrastructure for the state, while our project teams function as the regional links. So there's a lot of overlapping membership there. We've sort of Wisconsinized this, but also maintained fidelity to the active implementation frameworks and specifically the link teams. Our implementation zone as a whole is focused, as Melissa mentioned, on our statewide measurable result, or SIMR, which establishes improved performance in English language arts for students with IEPs in grades 3 to 5. Is sort of our North Star or long-term outcome, and that is based on our statewide assessment in ELA at this time. And so we hope that gives you kind of a flavor for the Wisconsin context and some of the work that we have underway. And with that, I will turn it over to our colleagues in Washington State.
Thanks, Scott. Hi, everyone. I'm Kurt Hatch. I'm going to get us started. I'm here with my colleague, Kelsey Schmitz. I'm beaming in from beautiful Olympia in the state of Washington, state capital. And just some of my background real quick. I'm using kind of a school and district leader perspective today. That's just based on my background as a teacher, a former instructional coach who really would have benefited at the time from understanding the science of implementation. And then also perspective of a school leader, assistant principal, district leader in about 8 different school districts in Washington State and internationally, and I think about 10 different schools. Also bringing the perspective of state leadership as a former associate director for the Principals Professional Association for Washington State, the Association of Washington School Principals, and now working as the faculty director and professor of practice for the Educational Leadership Program at the University of Washington on the Tacoma campus. So I'll talk a little bit about my experience after Kelsey introduces herself and just kind of the lens that I'm bringing around implementation science, how that's helped in a school setting. I'll tell a little story about one of the schools that I was principal at and just the impact that me finally having an understanding of implementation science and what it could do for evidence-based practices taking hold in a school setting, in a district setting. And also trying to bring that message as somebody who delivers keynotes in different places in the country and does some work with the SMART Center as a consulting partner. So with that, I'll turn it over to my colleague from the SMART Center, Kelsey.
Thank you, Kurt. Hi, everyone. Also coming to you from beautiful Olympia, Washington. Kurt and I live on opposite sides of the town, so it's not like we're neighbors or anything like that. But we are happy to be with you, happy to bring some of our work and experiences to this amazing group. I see some familiar names and faces, so it's great to be on with you all. I am the Director of Training and Technical Assistance at the University of Washington SMART Center, which stands for School Mental Health Assessment Research and Training Center. I am getting ready to celebrate my 5th year with the UW SMART Center and have worked previously at 2 different state education agencies as a part of MTSS efforts, as well as other universities, and have been a part of multiple different PBIS and MTSS efforts across different states and across the nation. So if you want to go to the next slide, I'll share just a little bit about the SMART Center. We are located in the Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences Department in the School of Medicine. What's unique and incredible about our center is that we have multiple partnerships across the university, including faculty from the College of Education, and most recently a formal partnership with the School of Social Work. We have a variety of research and evaluation, as well as training and TA projects, as well as community partnering and outreach as well. One of the things that we do at our center that is an exciting part of our work is reaching out across our region, our 4-state region. So we house the School Mental Health Supplement to the Northwest Mental Health Technology Transfer Center. And we support the school mental health workforce in Alaska, Oregon, Washington, and Idaho, and getting ready to start our 6th year of that project. So our reach is a little broader than a state, which makes it exciting to learn in and from other states. So if you want to go to the next slide, this just sort of illustrates our organization, kind of highlights those partnerships I mentioned, as well as our main efforts around outreach and partnerships, research and evaluation, workforce development, training and technical assistance, and policy. And on the next slide, just to give you an idea of our focus and the focus of our training and TA team, it is to support the integration of education and mental health systems to install and sustain comprehensive school mental health within a multi-tiered system of support framework. While we know that the practices, interventions, and supports are of utmost importance, we know that they need a delivery system. So our goal is to ensure that there's one cohesive system of support. And we do that by supporting sustainable district and building teams, building skills of the workforce, helping to develop data systems that guide the work and accountability, ensuring that we partner with the community, youth, and families, implementing and supporting strategies and systems that promote equity and address disparities. And influence of systems and policy is really key in our work, as I'll talk in a minute about. And then that use of tested implementation, and a word we've been using a lot lately, de-implementation strategies as well. So the next slide, as Melissa mentioned, kind of illustrates our work across the cascade of implementation. So from, the classroom to the workforce to the school system, district, regional, and state, the right side of this graphic sort of illustrates the ways that we are supporting implementation at each of those levels. And then finally, just to give you a sense of our training and technical assistance team and how we are organized and operate. We are made up of UW staff, as well as a network of consulting partners, such as Dr. Hatch. And we just include a wide variety of folks that have been school leaders, social workers, school counselors, classroom teachers, school psychologists, special educators, district administrators, family members, just to have a really big array of team members that represent and mirror different roles in the district, schools, and community. So Kurt's going to say a little bit more about the work that he has engaged with, but I do have to tell you a story, a quick story that represents a very key implementation strategy. When we moved here 8 years ago from Kansas and we were looking for a place to live, we were driving around the South Sound area and passed by an elementary school. And that elementary school had its PBIS expectations posted outside on a sign. And I turned to my husband and I said, we will live here. I want my kids to live in this community, in this town, and that supports PBIS implementation. So this isn't a made-up story. It really happened. I took a picture of it. I posted it on Facebook back in April of 2015. And then 2 years later, got to know the principal of Mountain View Elementary, and that was Dr. Kurt Hatch. So I'm going to turn it over to Kurt to tell a little bit more about himself, and then we'll move to the panel.
Thanks, Kelsey. Before I jump in, you just kind of inspired me to put this little resource in the chat. You were talking about, maybe I think you were talking about initiative overload and whatever setting we're talking about, whether it's school, private sector. And there's a great article by Doug Reeves that I just put in the chat that talks about how you've got to pull the weeds, talking about implementation overload, having all these initiatives flying around. People may be wondering who's in charge of what, including are the initiatives working? Are there too many of them? And typically there are. Kelsey and I know, as we've done our work across the state of Washington, that we'll ask school districts and organizations to list out, like post-it note, all the initiatives that are happening in their context. And not surprising, I'm starting to get used to this now, that there are dozens and dozens, some are over 100 initiatives in relatively small contexts. So then we follow up by asking questions like, well, who's in charge and how do we know they're working? What data are we using? All in an effort to just streamline our approaches for implementation. And as far as my learning curve was fairly high initially when I was trying to wrap my head around this whole thing of there being a science for implementation. But then I was also really relieved because it did help us move from siloed work, which there's a slide, a couple slides down I'll get to, talking about siloed work versus streamlining our work. But really what we had to do first as school leaders, because we were in professional learning communities in the district that I was in that Kelsey pointed out at Mountain View Elementary, we had to really even understand school leadership as a thing. Because people were asking us like, well, what do principals do? And we can talk for a long time about that. So some colleagues and I, when I moved to the Association of Washington School Principals, we developed this school leader paradigm. And I'll just pause to let you take a look at some of the things that are on that slide on the paradigm. So without going into a lot of depth, I can summarize it by saying on the right side is the doing side. We call that the doing side, where these are the things that school leaders do. I'm talking about district leaders, and I think this also can be translated out to leadership writ large, not necessarily just in a school or district context. But these are the things that we do as leaders. We create a culture and maintain a positive culture, make sure the organization is continually learning, and that we take care of the culture, systems, and learning of the people inside the organization. On the left side, we call that the becoming side. So that's thinking of the leader as a person needs to have personal intelligence, understand the systems and how they function, and understand like the psychology and sociology or the social context of the organization, and be consistently and constantly a learning leader themselves. So if you go to the next slide, the other things that we talked about was if you flip that paradigm upright So if somebody will click one more time, and see a little fancy little twirly of this hourglass. So that's the paradigm being turned on its side. We had to help people across the state understand really how they're situated as leaders, and there might be some role in all of your organizations that, based on how things are organized, they are situated in a similar spot as school leaders. So I'll explain this. So if you, at the top of the hourglass, if you were to pour in national or federal initiatives, regional or state initiatives, and policy, or if you were to turn it over and fill it with community priorities, students and staff, where we see school leaders in particular is situated right in the middle of that hourglass, because everything flows through the principalship. And there might be a position in your organizations that can be described in this way. Principals isn't the most important position in the educational system. All positions are important, but what we grew to understand is that the position of the principal is the most consequential position in the organization. So it was critical for principals to understand implementation science as a thing, that it is a thing, and essentially understanding that there is a best way and a right way to take evidence-based practices and enculturate them into the school. Let's see. Also, one of the things that we had to kind of reconcile with as school leaders who had done implementation of curriculums, for example, if anybody's in education for a while, they've touched or been touched by a curriculum adoption. And also probably come to the realization that most curriculum adoptions only go so far. And I think our profession actually is kind of famous for almost implementing things. And I say that just based on a lack of training around implementation science, and having a coach to help the school leader or anybody in the system understand what it looks and sounds like to do a couple things. And one is to give everyone some grace and space to slow down the planning process, to slow it way down, to also have time to pick the weeds so you can plant the flowers. So just do an assessment of how many things we got going on, and is there implementation fatigue? And then also giving grace and space to be very meticulous alongside a coach, with getting help from a coach, implementation coach, be very meticulous with our planning on how we're going to set goals and achieve things according to the science of implementation. We also had to go in just assuming that things are siloed. So if someone to go to the next slide, please. Assuming that things are siloed. That was just a common feature of the profession that I'm in. Things were siloed, and that assumed that implementation science is not being applied. So just start fresh, build a common vocabulary about what it looks and sounds like to implement things according to the science of implementation. And then what we discovered in doing that over time, it took a few years, is that, for example, in measuring the time out of class, that students were sent out of class because of behavioral health issues. So at Mountain View, we started measuring that prior to implementing things using science of implementation. And we discovered that in 1 year, there was 791 hours lost of instructional time because kids were being pushed out of class because of behavior or suspended. And I was all part of that as the principal. And then when we started implementing specific things, a multi-tiered system of support, also known as PBIS, or Positive Behavior Intervention Support. So that's a multi-tiered system of support. So we started using the science of implementation, which is embedded in PBIS, to meticulously plan and move things forward. And so we ended up in 1 year recapturing over 500 hours of instructional time. The school just calmed down, staff morale went up, and it was all because we were just being very transparent with how we were implementing things, and we went through a process, just took the time to do that. So that's just some of the perspective that I wanted to offer. I'm going to turn it back to Kelsey.
And I'm going to turn it back to Sophia.
Awesome. I was like, wait. So now we want to hear from the panel, from all of our colleagues, around different strategies they've used or different approaches they've taken in their work. And we wanted to do that through a series of questions. So the first, and we'll start with Kelsey and Scott and Kurt. Give us a little bit more about the successes you've had in creating the conditions for making that science of implementation really part of the culture and climate or way of work in your organization.
Yeah, so I was really fortunate that when I started working at the UW Smart Center, their research and initial work around training NTA was already solidly grounded in implementation science. They have we have some incredible implementation science researchers on our team, so it wasn't challenging. I was already coming in to a culture that that was really anchored to implementation science. And I think as we have grown our training and technical assistance side, some of the specific things that we have done is just a real commitment to moving beyond training in one-time events. Hey, can your team come out for this 1 hour thing to rally us all around a specific thing that we really care about? We really kind of stick to our values and our understanding that those one-time events can have really little to no impact on systems change. So we continue to just keep building up what our ongoing and follow-up technical assistance and coaching and other post-training supports look like when we're working with organizations. So the training is just the event, but really designing and co-designing with whomever our partner is, what do those ongoing and follow-up supports look like? And as we kind of joke, how do we work ourselves out of a job? How do we really emphasize and prioritize building capacity within their local community to continue this work on?
Thank you, Scott. What about successes you've had?
Yeah, so at the state level, there are lots of resources that NERN and SISEP have created, and one of the challenges at the state level is it's a really large network of things that state education agencies do. And so Melissa and I spent quite a bit of time last year and the year before working with primarily our IDEA discretionary grant, some of those project teams and grant directors around capacity building. And we found ourselves using kind of a model of doing some mini lessons or direct instruction, for lack of a better word, around some of the components and tools from implementation science, and then allowing project teams to use those for their own planning, for the development of their projects. And that started to establish a few things. One was curiosity and a basic knowledge base around what implementation science is and how it can be leveraged. And two, it helped provide some tools and resources to grant teams when they're stuck, when they're facing a barrier or a question that they're having trouble moving beyond. So an example of that for our state that's been probably the most commonly used are the capacity assessments, specifically the regional capacity assessment and district capacity assessment, because these we found have given teams language and a structure within which to have conversations, and also a way to prioritize their work and come away from the assessments with specific action plans and next steps for building out there. So it's almost like a twofer. They're not only learning about implementation science, but they're coming away with really specific things to work on. And those things that they're working on are directly aligned to the active implementation frameworks. The other unintended, I would say, consequence or benefit of this is that teams are seeking Melissa and me out when they have questions because they've learned enough about implementation science that they're looking for a partner to sort of guide them in their work. And that's been a very organic way of kind of continuing to establish a common way of work. My first implementation teacher, Barbara Sims, back in the day, you always remember your kindergarten teacher and you always remember your first implementation science teacher. She used to use a phrase, gentle pressure applied relentlessly. And so Melissa and I will joke about the fact that we are like a gentle presence that is relentless. When we're in meetings, when we're in different work groups and things like that, even if it isn't an implementation aligned activity specifically, we're always bringing in the components and the structure and the frameworks of implementation science to continue to demonstrate how it makes our work more effective.
Great, thank you. And Kurt, you mentioned building that climate and slowing way down, right, to build that climate and planning. What successes have you had for creating those conditions for implementation?
Sure. Yeah. Thinking back to the example I used before around Mountain View, part of it was just being really transparent with what we were setting out to do and help everyone understand that implementation science is a thing. And building a common vocabulary around what we were talking about when we were mentioning implementation science and the steps involved, talking about the coaching that was needed. And we were able to draw some parallels with things that were already happening in the district because there were instructional coaches. And instructional coaches played a role from teacher to teacher, but I was also interested in having them help with implementing initiatives across the school and at the district level. So yeah, we did slow down. I mean, in order to implement things, there's no fast way of doing it within a really complex setting like a school that's kind of ever changing and really nuanced. So we just had lots of conversations about what we were doing, kind of laid it out to people, and once laid out, it made a lot of sense. It does make a lot of sense, and it helped our staff know that there's things that they can stop doing in order to start doing the right things, and so things will take hold. So just lots of conversations about that at the school setting. And then, at the state level, I'll also mention when working with principals and creating training and doing some mentoring, and now also doing some mentoring as a consultant. Helping people understand the science of implementation was also a feature of reducing burnout for school leaders and teachers, and reducing the churn. We call the churn because at least in the state of Washington, we think this is nationally too, about 1 in 5 principals, only 1 in 5 will remain in the same building after 4 years. And part of what folks were telling us about the stress level of being a school leader is around really just having a hard time getting things to take hold, like they're kind of running in sand. So when we were able to help them understand implementation science more and more, frankly, it just elevated their morale because they're thinking, at first they were thinking, I don't know how to implement certain things, and behavior is really stressing teachers out and we're not getting the outcomes that we want. But when they learned more about how to implement evidence-based practices, I think it just increased their hope level because they saw outcomes improving.
Great, thank you. So we'll start with Mel this time, and then go Scott and Kelsey. Given your role as implementation specialists, right? We've spent a lot of time, I know, in our work together and in the work at large, really talking about removing barriers because they're always there, right? We're always going to run into them. So can you give us some insight into how, in your experience, you've really learned how to not just remove barriers, but really leverage the strengths that, in the organizations that you're working with?
Yeah, thanks, Sophia. When I started out as a middle school social studies teacher, I certainly never imagined that at some point I would be working at the state level. and functioning as an implementation specialist. What I really appreciate about the work that NERN and SISEP have done and the research around it is, really providing sort of that context, that structure, that framing for what an implementation specialist is. And I can remember there have been a couple of moments over the last several years where I've had this like, oh, I actually am an implementation specialist, right? Like I actually know that, the way in which Scott and I work and others that have built similar capacity are able to bring that into our work relationships, the context of the work. And as Scott said, this idea of the gentle presence or the gentle pressure, in order to strengthen facilitators and remove barriers, I feel like we're always watching for them. We're always watching for them, and we're always thinking about how we frame them in that way. And we try to be really explicit about it with the teams we're working with. Scott has said, and I recognize that we often do that thing where we help others take a few steps and get up on the figurative balcony, right? And from a competency standpoint, you can't do that unless you have relationships. And as an ISP, some of the most critical things that we do are build and strengthen relationships across the cascade of the system in the context of our work. And so I think that's really critical. And those relationships really don't matter much unless you've got really strong ways of communicating, interacting through effective team structures, engaging with data. That's a work that is still underway, especially when you start to get, districts and schools are so complex in and of themselves. And then you start layering in some of these other levels of the system. And, you talk about complex systems upon complex systems. And an ISP, in order to navigate a lot of that and really think about how we amplify facilitators and mitigate barriers, is really dependent upon the communication protocols, the systems and structures we have across the cascade. I can remember administering a DCA with a district, and there's a question toward the end that gets at the idea of the district having a system or a process in place to lift up barriers or policy relevant information to the state. And Kurt, I don't know if you've experienced this, but like they sort of look at you like you've got two heads. Like this idea that district is connected to state is not necessarily something that is front of mind for those folks at the district and school level. As implementation support practitioners, we can really help to sort of smooth that system intervention process as one of the drivers of implementation, and make sure that based on the relationships we have at the state level, that we're really able to frame that in ways where folks have agency in order to address
them. God, what about you?
Yeah, so Melissa alluded to this, and I'll just kind of expand on it because it gets to more of our regional infrastructure. As I mentioned earlier, we have sort of a wide array of grant project teams who do a lot of different things, ranging from basic technical assistance all the way through really intensive partnering and coaching around specific needs. And one of the things, outside of the formation of, formal implementation teams, I think one of the things that we've done well to address some of the barriers that arise from working across so many different areas with so many teams is we've created structures that allow for collaboration, collective problem solving, the identification of common barriers. So instead of having individual grant teams out there all struggling in silos with the same thing, we've created structures that allow them to communicate and talk and start to identify and lift up, what are the things that we're all facing. Most recently, an example of this has been, so we have a statewide coordinators group. All of our grant projects have a statewide coordinator who sort of leads and coordinates their statewide activities. And we have a team of all of those folks who come together. It's led by Deb Wall, who is herself a statewide coordinator, and Joseph Conkey, who's our statewide coaching coordinator. And the purpose of this group is to identify and problem solve around barriers. And one of the ones that they've worked on over the course of really last year and now into this year has been around professional learning. So as I mentioned before, we have a lot of great resources around coaching, not so much around training, which has led to a variety of interpretations of how training is provided, how training is developed, how it's linked to coaching, the kinds of data we're collecting around it. So our statewide coordinators group has really come together to develop some resources and tools that individual project and grant teams can use when they're developing training that kind of lends itself to a common way of work and a common way of approaching this, common data collection, so we can start to gauge training effectiveness and impact. And it's been a great way of leveraging the expertise of folks from across these. So while it is a formal implementation team, they're definitely using the frameworks and the ISP competencies in their work together.
Kelsey, you work in all different contexts. So what about removing barriers with them or strengthening facilitators?
Yeah, and I just quickly wanted to mention, Scott mentioned, you always remember your first implementation science teachers, and that took me in the Wayback Machine for a minute. So I just have to name Peter Griggs and Rachel Freeman at the University of Kansas, who first exposed me to this 2005 implementation science monograph, and what a difference it's made in my career. Yeah, a little a little different in kind of the folks that we're working directly with, the things that we have been learning. One of the things that we have started as kind of a non-negotiable, if we are working with a district and then training building teams, is the importance of having the district team members or a set of core members that are always at those building team trainings. And what we've watched happen is just immediate problem solving, immediate identification of a barrier, and a district person there to either be like, oh, here's the thing, here's the resource, here's the explanation, here's how the district defines that, or I'm going to directly find that information out for you and follow up. And just the ability to do that real-time problem solving, having the district teams at the table during those building team trainings has helped immensely. I was also thinking when Melissa was talking about barrier removal and, not only getting to work and stand on the shoulders of giants in this field and learning from their experiences, but building up experiences as an implementation support practitioner in a way that you can start to anticipate barriers and help teams plan for that. So we were just recently doing some building team training with some buildings, and we were taking stock of all the teams that they had in their building. And it's interesting to watch this process, both at the district and the building level, because they are immediately shocked once they start listing all of the teams. And there's this instant kind of realization of, oh, well, this explains why we're all so tired. So, we try to, in our training, I remember saying to them, like, somebody right now, somewhere at the district, the region, the state, the national level is working on a new thing. And that new thing will be coming your way. So plan now for when somebody says, here's the greatest new thing we're going to be doing, to take stock and go back to your teams and say, where does this thing fit into our existing teams? Instead of creating a brand new team for an initiative that might fit in somewhere else.
Great, thank you. That's true. It's one of my favorite activities to do with buildings is look at their teams. Kurt, this one's to you. We know that leaders at either district or school level are just, really pivotal to this work, right? So when you think about, the work that you've done and the work you're doing in your mentoring now, how do we help build some of these competencies in preparing our leaders and fostering these skills?
Yeah, I'll go back to a comment I made earlier around just helping folks understand that implementation science is a thing. It's a thing for us to study and understand. It's pivotal to leadership as a thing because, you know, as a school principal, my main charge was to improve outcomes, improve academics and behavioral and mental health outcomes. And so I really wanted to know how do I go about doing that in this complex environment where there's different interests, different stress levels, new kids coming in all the time and their families with variety of needs. So it's very complex. So I just thought there has to be like a best way and a right way to approach this leadership work. And lo and behold, there is. I do wish that I had known about that earlier on in my career. However, you know, there are certain things like when you implement a multi-tiered system of support, and I'd mentioned PBIS or positive behavior intervention supports. Fortunately for me, I started to learn about implementation science through the implementation of PBIS because implementation science is built into that process. So what we learned was we have to work the process. And that in a lot of ways, the process is the product itself, because when we learn about implementation science and have that become part of the culture, then that's just how we roll. But it took a bit for me to understand that. And one of the things that I remember around coaching in particular, and Kelsey can help me with the source of this because I can't remember. But it's really simple because Kelsey had mentioned earlier, and maybe someone else did too, around we can't just go after the shiny object or go out and do this fancy workshop and come back with a whole bunch of online resources, or back in the day it was coming back with a binder from this great presentation, and then we're gonna come back on Monday as a principal and say, hey everybody, I've got this great idea that I just learned and we're gonna go for it. Send out some emails and hope everybody starts doing it. So the resource, it goes like this. If you experience a workshop where somebody's demonstrating something, there is a 5% chance that it will get implemented in your context. If the workshop not only demonstrates it, but allows time for you to practice it, there's a 5% chance that it will be implemented, whatever that thing is. If you go to the workshop, you hear about it, it's demonstrated, and you practice. Again, that's the third layer. So you hear about it, it's demonstrated, and you practice it. There's also a 5% chance that you'll implement. But if there's coaching alongside that over time, then the chance of implementation goes up to 95%. So understanding that just helped me understand the importance of coaching, especially relative to the science of implementation.
There we go. We have some people who are helping you out in the chat with there we go. Kelsey, put it in the chat. The Joyce and Showers work. Right.
Thank you.
All right. So our last question, and then hopefully we'll have time to get one in from the chat, because it's a great question and it's something we've been thinking about here at SISEP too. But first, we mentioned we've heard several of you mention, right, that the schools that we work in, the districts, are very complex environments, right? And within that, implementation is multifaceted as well. So starting with Scott, where would you recommend we start? Where we even begin implementation and using our skills? How do we build this readiness and go slow, like Kurt tells us?
Yeah, so a couple of things, and I think Kurt and Kelsey mentioned this earlier too. One is to look at what can we stop doing. Coming from a school building background as a teacher and administrator, it never occurred to me that we could stop doing things. It felt like we were always just adding to the plate. And I think we need to pause and give ourselves permission to, if we're going to add something in, take something away, or more than one thing away. I think a great strategy for doing that for really any level of the system, we're undergoing this process right now as a state, is to do an initiative inventory and really take a look at all of the things you have going on, the resources that are attached to those things, the intended outcomes, the data that you have around how effective or not they are, whether you have data around those things, and have that be the place before you choose to do another new thing. Pause. The other part of it is, what is the problem we're trying to solve? And are we already doing things related to that problem? And if we are, what impact are those things having? And are there things that we should stop doing? And kind of build that buy-in and the collective commitment toward doing something new. But those would be my top is a place to start, definitely an initiative inventory.
Wow.
Yeah, there actually, I think I saw a comment in the chat earlier too around that idea of, we know implementation is stage-based, right? And so, what Scott is talking about are those things that we typically do and should do, and as implementation support practitioners should really be emphasizing, is lifting up that critical stage of exploration. Right? Kelsey, you mentioned the idea, like, stuff is going to be coming at you. What are you doing right now to make sure that you can anticipate that and plan accordingly so that we're immediately planning for sustainability from the very beginning? Connecting to the initiative inventory, going from that within the stage of exploration, the hexagon tool. And I know this sounds maybe like a commercial or something for, some of NERD's tools and things, but I'm telling you, like, they're really meaningful and they can be really impactful, and they're concrete in a way that really helps district and school teams and other teams connected to them to really think about the ways in which we are planning for sustainability from the very beginning. The hexagon tool looks at, provides a process, a structure, and critical components to examine specific strategies or practices. Kurt mentioned the shiny object that you come back from a workshop with. Well, sit down with the hexagon tool first in order to determine whether or not that is something that your learning community needs, and then is there an evidence base for it, and does it fit within the context? Do you have the appropriate resources to use it to fidelity, and do you have the right systems and structures in place? And if you don't, do you have the capacity to build those out? The stages analysis tool can also be a really critical resource in helping teams get started in their journey on implementation. Again, stages aren't linear. You might be in the installation stage on one thing, but way back at exploration for something else. And that tool can really help to frame some of the critical stage-based activities that are useful in supporting tangible efforts related to implementing evidence-based practices.
Kelsey, give us a starting place.
Well, first of all, I would just echo what Melissa and Scott have said. The lifting up of those activities and those tools are situated in the beginning of our training and TA process when we work with states, regions, districts, and schools. And so really starting with taking stock of what you have and where we can make room for this new thing instead of just piling on. We have been connecting that back to staff wellness. We might think of staff wellness as in other ways, but doing less or understanding how things align can really help with staff wellness. Some things that I would add would be thinking about from the very beginning is how we're including voices that have been historically excluded or marginalized. Not waiting until the plane is halfway built to asking what those most impacted by it think about it. So gathering that feedback from families, from community partners, from students. Another thing I would look at is if you're in a school or a district, looking at your district strategic plan and being really clear about how you're going to leverage your strategic plan to implement this work. How are you connecting the work back to that strategic plan? We were just with a district over the last couple of days who's been presenting on their implementation over time. And, they just reiterated the importance of, they had to take a year. They just had to take a year and calibrate what it was and create a common understanding and a common vocabulary for this initiative around embedding school mental health within MTSS. So they identified sort of a key publication that they all did a book study on for several months, if not the entire year, and brought people in from cabinet. So before they launched it out, really understanding what the thing was. So I would just add that to maybe a list of things you can do to get started.
Thank you. All right, we did have one question in the chat that we'll try to take really quickly before we tie this all up with a bow. Is it Drea? I hope I got that right, from my home state of Maine. She put in the chat, and some of you alluded to this a little bit. How do you assist schools that are already bogged down with all the things, right? But they haven't yet really done any significant work, like Kelsey's describing, on what they're already doing, or the capacity assessments, Mel and Scott, that you mentioned.
I will jump in just as, and Scott, this piggybacks off of something that you said, and I mean, everybody's alluded to some of this. Schools already bogged down. A school isn't necessarily bogged down in and of itself. The school belongs to a system, and that system is the district. And so, as we've been talking about exploration, and as Scott mentioned, you really have to be clear about the problem you're trying to solve. And Kelsey mentioned the idea of connecting to a district strategic plan. If a school is left to toil away on a site-based island by themselves and figure this out, they might get as far as the amazing individuals in that school can get them, but it's not necessarily sustainable. And so, again, from that ISP perspective, that would be one reminder or sort of like nugget that I would emphasize is really critical. And doing a lot of that exploration work at the district level with schools and other voices, as Kelsey mentioned, those other critical perspectives included in that build out of what is the problem we're trying to solve? What is our common vision and mission? What is our collective commitment to this work? Both short, medium, and long term, I think are critical aspects of helping schools to not have to figure this out in a silo, but to do it as part of a system.
Thank you. And Doug has a question in the chat that's actually going to lead us to our very next section and where we're winding up, which is, if you're just starting this work, where do you go to learn some more? We're working very hard here at SISEP to create a micro-credentialing program. That micro-credentialing program works you through a number of levels, up to 8. But the beginning parts of this really are talking about the basic active implementation frameworks in combination with other implementation strategies and tools and routines. And we pair each of those implementation frameworks and strategies with the implementation support practitioner competency. So you're learning both about some of the more technical tools and work, or the more adaptive work of bringing strategies to our complex environments, and the skills required to do that. So we've put in the chat a number of links if you're interested in this. First is the written overview that you can see up on the screen. We also have some video information about what this is. You can access the micro-credentialing for more information right there on the Active Implementation Hub. But what you'll really want to do is fill out the bit.ly form that's in there, because that will, any new information about the micro-credentialing, that will come through, that list, if you will. So we really hope you sign up to learn more about this work. And then join our ongoing conversation is another place where you can learn more. You can contact the center itself for more information. We have a number of communities of practice in the works. You can really look at those as well. There's other resources like the AI Hub, the podcast, our YouTube videos. So just so many places to go to begin to learn about what this work really looks like and sounds like. We'll send all of that out with the recording. As always, we value your feedback, so we'll send out a feedback survey as well if you want to take a few minutes now to fill it out. But before you go, I just want to say thank you to our panelists for sharing your knowledge with us and all the amazing things you do.